Hello, folks. I'm James A. Rosen. The A is important. James Rosen is a Fox News contributor. I am not. Um, you can find me everywhere online at James A. Rosen. I want to talk to you a little bit about Ember at scale. And by scale, I mean basically number of features on a page or number of developers working on an application. And really, when I mean to talk about Ember at scale, I mean conventions, because nothing else supports scale like conventions. I'm going to talk a little bit about conventions from an American perspective. I'd like to hear what you folks across the pond have to say about the word conventional. But in America, if you say convention, it's kind of a negative connotation. In fact, it can sometimes be a very negative connotation. It's not only negative, it's also very obvious. If I show this picture to an American audience, they'll think of the fish as on the right as going his own way, not getting lost. Right? This is not a negative fish going to the right. Conventional as a word is even more interesting, and I think it's obvious how negative it is. Because if you think about what a conventional strawberry actually is in the real world, it should be the 2,000-year-old strawberry, which is completely inedible by humans. It was only in the 11th century that we got to the point where we could put netting over strawberries and grow them to a point where they would be interesting and edible. But for the 1,000 years after that, we had pretty good, nice, happy strawberries that just grew from nature. And it's only this most modern sort of pro-organic movement, which I have no comment on particularly here, other than they've adopted the word conventional as bad and as having chemicals that are bad for you in their mind. Conventional is used as branding. Here we see an American oil company, the good oil on the left, the high, quality 5 out of 5 oil droplets. Conventional oil, the stuff that comes out of dinosaurs, on the right being conventional, being negative. But programmers face decisions. We face a lot of them every day, whether to have tea or coffee brought to you by your, nice wait staff at the Hilton each morning, to naming conventions, choosing a name for a variable or whatever. These decisions are small, but they're taxing. Conventions help maintain our energy as we go through our day. They help maintain organization in the code so that if two people come into conflict, they're working on different things. As Tom said, as his quote said, the conventions let me drop in immediately and start getting to work without worrying about the various intricacies, the idiosyncrasies of the app. Big software is not built, it's grown. It's different from a building where you're done at a certain point and then you're maintaining it. Software grows continuously, or most software grows continuously over its life cycle. So it's about being able to continually do the weeding and the seeding that's needed. There are a lot of good conventions in Ember. There's a lot of great documentation in Ember, but that documentation is only good if you follow the conventions. The framework will guide your development, which means that new junior devs or people who are unfamiliar with Ember, or at least unfamiliar with your app, can get up and going quickly, but again, only if your app obeys the conventions. So as you saw in the first talk tonight, our app, being a relatively old Ember app, does not obey really any of the Ember conventions. And that means that it's very hard for somebody new to come on and learn what they're doing, because it's all idiosyncratic. Here's a good convention in Ember. This is the idea of the nested route. So I've shown you the first slash, which is basically the root of the application. The first slash is the first thing that happens on your page, and it's a good place to load global state. So in the upper right-hand corner, you see the current user icon. That's some global state. So in the application route, I'm going to, in the model, fetch the current user. It's an obvious place to do it in the route. This is great because it parallels when I dig deeper. I get to the list of filters, also called views, depending on your nationalization. When I want to get that list, I dig one level deeper in the URL, and I get to the filter route. I return the list of filters. It parallels exactly the data, the global data I fetched earlier. And then when I dig a layer deeper into filters 102, I fetch the 102nd filter. So there's a self-similarity as you go down these routes. That's a good convention for how to fetch data and show it to your users. Another convention that we've found, possibly by being burned by, is always be upgrading. But it's not just being burned. It's strongly beneficial. Ember has a very fast delivery cycle. They go from canary to beta to release every 6 weeks. And these releases are all backwards compatible, although I'm going to hold you to this on the next one with with view_state, but we're going to get to that. So this cycle is really fast, but it does deliver benefits. This is the difference between Ember 09 and 1.4 in rendering a particular ticket. It's an 80% increase by upgrading. And the performance metrics that we've done on 1.5 and 1.6 testing out show it's at least as fast every time. Right? So the Ember team has your back. They're doing good work. It behooves you to stay current. This is our long history with Ember, starting in 2002, February. One of the things that we use to do this are tests. Doing upgrades on a large app is difficult. You probably can't do it in a single pull request. We did it over the last 18 months. So you need to have tests to make sure that you're not backsliding as you go. So this is a Travis configuration file. This is really good for us. It lets us run all of our test suite on 3 different versions of Ember at the same time. This is really nice. And that last bit says, 1.6 we're interested in, but don't break the build. We'll clean it up later, before we're ready to ship. Another convention in Ember is very generic components. So a component is an isolated chunk of the view. And there are lots of great places for generic components in your app. So I showed you that little bit of global state, the user profile icon. If you click on that icon, you get a menu about things to do with the user. This is how I might model it in the view layer. And you'll notice that these components are very generic, right? There's a button that you click and shows a popover. It has nothing to do with the Zendesk domain. You can write these kinds of components your own. There are also some libraries out there. InStructure has a bunch of individual components called ICMenu, ICModal. There's Ember UI, which is a little bit like a jQuery UI kind of holistic package of a bunch of components. There's Ember Components, which is embercomponents.com, I think. Is just a list of interesting components. It's not meant to be a standalone package of everything. You just sort of pick and choose the couple that you want. They integrate with other JavaScript libraries out there. It's not all written from scratch. It's sort of doing Ember wrapping of things. And you can wrap things on your own. If you want to use Masonry or Chosen or some other nice little UI utility, you can wrap that at an Ember component level. And there are patterns and documents and there's documentation online about how to wrap and make sure that their library isn't going to infect the rest of your Ember app, that it stays in that nice isolated state. And of course, you can write your own. But what I love about Ember is that the component abstraction works great for generic components, but also for very domain-specific ones. It's really nice to see a piece of our application like this that is repeatable. And you saw earlier with Intercom those little choosy UI elements that you can select an additional filter and then add details. That's a great use of a component that probably not a lot of other apps use, but is good for them. This shows you the status of a ticket, and I don't think anyone outside of Zendesk is likely to use this component, so it's not really a good open source thing, but it's definitely reusable inside Zendesk. One of the patterns that we see in components is declaring the required input data, right? So a component is largely worthless unless it interacts somehow with the data of your app, either as input or output or both. So it's a good idea to declare the places where that data is needed, what you need to pass to the component to make it work. You can either do that with EM required or just by declaring it as null, as an indication to the developer what they might want to pass in. Ooh, that seems to be in the wrong spot. So moving on, Ember has a bunch of great conventions. There are some places where its conventions sort of fall short. Not that it has bad conventions, but it just doesn't have them yet. Our app demands, or any large app demands, a long string of conventions. Ember provides you a great starting point. And what I'm going to show you now is some things to add to the set of Ember conventions that might get you a little further. So services, this is Kiki's delivery service. Tom Dale has a pull request out for a convention in Ember about services. It's not out yet, but if you have an idea of a service layer, something like local storage or a real-time push notifications object, these sort of things are great to wrap as services. And the forthcoming Ember convention might look something like this. You extend EM service and add your own API, and then just ask for this .services, the name of your service to get access to it. This is a great convention. You can start using it now even if you're not on the latest Ember just by sort of establishing this convention. Or if you already have a convention for this, I would say get in place a strategy to start to migrate to the new one. Sounds great. Thanks, Tom. As we go further in the building of a large-scale application, the next convention I want to talk about is lazily loaded code. So one of the things we found as we were upgrading Ember was the amount. Where's my performance metric? Show me performance. There it is. Oh, that is the wrong performance metric. Damn it! Don't have it. Man, sad. All right, so if you have 50 features on a page, the user might not interact with but 1 or 2 or 3 of them. It helps to not ship all of that code at once. So the idea of loading code on demand as the user navigates around the app really helps boot time performance. So it can be as simple as this. This is the dumbest thing that could possibly work. In your route, you fetch some subset of the application and run it, and you're done. At Zendesk, we have a bit more structure around it than this, but that's essentially it. Man, these slides just got totally destroyed tonight. It's very sad. That's state outside the router. So Ember has a convention of keeping all page state in the router and thus mapped to the URL bar, but there's state that you probably don't want to keep inside inside the URL. So for example, the sort order on this table doesn't map to any URL. And so the convention that's being built in Ember is the idea of query params, which you could serialize to the URL, but you don't have to. It could just be stored on the controller, which is another convention that I think will eventually come to some release version of Ember, but isn't there yet. Next beta, all right. So another convention that we've found useful at Zendesk, we had initially tried shipping Ember as a static HTML page with static assets. And, Ember is a framework for building a front-end application, so that seemed like a pretty good fit. It worked well for a while, but we discovered that there are a lot of benefits to having even a little bit of server-side rendered HTML to sort of bootstrap the application. So I don't care what framework or what toolkit you use, ignore the elephant on the right. No, seriously, even if you use them, it's still valuable. So one of the benefits that you get by being able to render some stuff server-side is that you can pre-render some data. So that global state that we fetched, having to make an AJAX call on boot slows down your boot time by 30 or 40 milliseconds. If you inject it directly into the page, if you multiply that by 50 different pieces of data to preload, that gets expensive. If you can ship them all together in one API call or put them all pre-rendered into the DOM, and by pre-rendered I don't mean HTML, I just mean some data that you can fetch. So now we have sort of an Ember data kind of deserializer or store that looks up for things in the DOM instead of over AJAX. This is a great way to speed up the boot time performance of your app. And this change got a 16% improvement on boot time. The other thing that you can do with dynamic HTML in the back end is you can choose which version of Ember to ship, right? So we don't feel comfortable shipping large changes to all of our customers at once. Instead, we roll it out percent by percent to partials of our customer set. So this is a really simple way of choosing which version of Ember to ship if you feel reasonably comfortable. We do something a little more sophisticated than this, but it's not that much more sophisticated. It's you won't ever fall back to an earlier version once you've seen 1.5, unless we turned it off completely. But it's essentially this. And overall boot time, we got down 11% with some of these server-side rendering improvements. So now we get into the conventions that are totally off the beaten path and just happen when you're working on a really large team that are all working in the same DOM. So one of the problems that we deal with at Zendesk is that we have, I think, 8 different teams who all work in this same Ember app. And they like to ship code at their own pace, right? They don't want to all be beholden by the same deploy cycle. So we're working on ways to do what I call service-oriented architecture in the DOM. That is, if you have a piece of your app that's the ticketing or the voice or the app framework, you can ship that separately. HTTP gives us a great way of doing this. It's called the URL. And the browser will do these fetches for you automatically. So if you name your piece of the code, the browser will just fetch that piece. It's a great way to inject dependencies. The problem is you end up with 2 competing pieces of the DOM. So the ticket.js framework with the models, the views, and the controllers for ticketing needs to render this whole section of the page. But the apps framework may not have been loaded yet, or maybe it was loaded. There's no way to know. And yet it has to figure out how to render into here. So our first thought was in the ticket index route, we're gonna fetch the ticket and then render the view. But then how do we get data in there? Apps.js may not have been loaded. We may not have any of the data. So, and we need to inject ticket-specific data, not just generic stuff. So our first question is, how do we inject the right content? The apps framework needs to know about the current ticket so that it can pick the right apps data. So the router, and a router event works really well if apps.js is already loaded. So if we loaded both components, we've been navigating around the app for 20 minutes, we've used the whole thing and everything's loaded. If the ticket route emits an event that says, oh, I've just rendered ticket 127, then the app framework can listen for that on the router and figure out how to render something into the DOM. That works great. The problem is the first one. So on that first load, the convention that we're leaning towards right now is that the apps framework asks the router for an object called current handler infos, which is a list of all of the models that it's loaded. And that way it can pull out the data that it needs that is the current state, right? There's otherwise no way to access what is the current ticket that I'm looking at. So that's how the apps framework knows which content to load. But how does it know how to get into that piece of the DOM? So the first thought was nested outlets, but Ember says no. Ember does not let you do this. Ember nested outlets is not a thing in the way that we wanted to do it. And that's because we don't have all of the data pre-loaded, right? This is asynchronously rendering into an outlet. There's no way to connect an outlet outside of the router interaction because no route is firing later asynchronously when the apps framework loads. I think the best option is the next option we considered is the idea of a null sidebar component. So the ticketing system would have a null version, an empty version, that it would just render. And that way it has something to put over there, even though it's empty. And then later, once the apps framework is loaded, the next time you render a ticket, it would use the correct one, because the container would have replaced the implementation. And that is very elegant, but you can't do dynamic replacement on the first load. So the best solution seems to be some sort of singleton container view that they both have a reference to. This is a tough convention, and I think we're going to see it more. We may end up developing some sort of library or pattern around this. This is at the edge of where we're working at Zendesk. Again, because we have so many people who are working at the same time in the same DOM, at least 60 engineers. One of the other things that can happen when you're at that scale, when people are deploying on their own speed, is you get conflicts. You can have CSS conflicts or global variable conflicts. Anything can really hurt interactivity on that same DOM. And at first, we shied away from iframes. We really felt that they were hard to negotiate. They're not that evil. They're not easy, and it's pretty tough to coordinate the browser location within an iframe across that iframe barrier to the Ember router. It is difficult, but in some places it really seems to be the best solution. Oftentimes we'll have a team that doesn't have any interest in building Ember because their product would not benefit from having the kinds of conventions that Ember has. Instead, they want to just develop a really simple form or a document viewer or something. Ember doesn't really help you there. And so they'll deploy something in their own Sinatra or Rails app or whatever, and we'll just embed that content with an iframe. Again, there are a lot of little nitty-gritty things to overcome, but I think actually adding some support for iframes would be a good convention when you're working at really large scale. The last thing I want to talk about is how you enforce conventions. And this is, I think, the one thing that we've done really, really well at Zendesk. So there are times when we've had no convention for some piece of code, or we've had a convention that Ember then changes and we need to migrate. And so the question is, how do we get everybody onto the same page? We work at a scale where we can't make one pull request and change everything in one go. So instead what we do is we build a convention test. And a convention test has a whitelist of current examples and then a rule that you cannot break. That rule could be about a file name or about a line of code, any way of writing this matcher, basically. And so what we do is we say, oh, right now we have no ES6 modules. We would like to migrate to have on all ES6 modules. So we whitelist all of our files, and then we say you must end your file name with ES6. And that way, if some new developer comes onto the team or someone who doesn't know about this new convention writes a new non-ES6 file, the build will break, and they will immediately learn the new convention. They don't have to wait for some email that they may have missed 3 weeks ago and dig through their inbox to find out, you didn't tell me that I needed to do this. Well, it's just easier this way. And now they've learned the right thing to do, and they're going to correct it, and now we're no longer backsliding. And then later we can whittle down the whitelist over time. So similarly, in between Ember 09 and 1.4 or 1.0, they changed Ember assert to Ember.assert. So we had some 200 instances of Ember_assert, and it's just too hard to change them all at once. So we just whitelisted the places that we had and changed them slowly. Precompiling your templates is a really good idea, but it's very easy to get into the habit of just putting a quick little EM handlebars compile into your view or your component because it's so easy. But as soon as you do that, you're now requiring the full handlebars compiler and runtime in your browser, which is slow. So this is a great way to make sure that we don't make that simple, easy mistake, and we really maintain performance in our app. You can write. Oh, this is a great one. So the Ember core team has threatened to keep adding underscores to the name of app.container as long as they keep seeing people accessing it directly in production. So this is a good way for us to keep from doing so. So you're not your own special snowflake. Conventions make your life happier. Ember is a framework of conventions. Buy into them. Start small. They only take you so far, so you're going to need your own conventions. Write them carefully, think about them, and then use tests to support them and keep going. Thank you. In the back.
Yeah, one thing that we've been kind of struggling with is how to maintain the authorization convention. So, holding on to something like an access token and using that for all the requests. Do you guys have a solution for that?
Yeah. So the question is, how do you maintain an authorization token and use it for all of the requests, rather than duplicating that logic over and over and over, or making unauthorized requests and having pieces of your app break when tokens expire? Yeah. So I think this new services idea is going to be helpful. There are a couple of different places that you could put that code. We do it in Initializer. So we have a library called Ember Resource, which is a sort of very lightweight wrapper around jQuery's Ajax functionality that we wrote before Ember Data existed. In the Ember Data world, there are hooks there are places you can hook into to add those sorts of tokens and then replace them as you get requests. But there are going to be places where you use requests. You want to make requests that aren't using your data persistence framework, right? You don't really want to be storing or fetching a model. You want to be doing a quick little post, right, from some controller instead of using the framework. So what we did in Ember Resources, we exposed the actual Ajax functionality so that when we do the initialization and we set up how you set tokens on the headers on Ajax requests, in that anyone else can access that functionality directly. You can do the same thing with jQuery with adding a pre-filter. I don't know about Ember Data or EPF or any of the others. But yeah, I would do it in an initializer and keep that functionality small and not have to worry about it other places, rather than, basically don't ask for it in all of the various places. Just assume that it exists and code to make sure that it does. Yeah. Yeah, so if our initialization code says that every couple of minutes we automatically expire the token and replace it, but also if we get a 403, we will assume there is no token and fetch a new one. So. Nobody else? Sounds like it's pizza time.